Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the support to get it through report stage, and I'm confident we'll be sending this bill to the Senate. It's critically important that we send this bill to the Senate, this bill becomes law, because having lived through a pandemic that no one wants to live through again, it's important we put measures in place here today as parliamentarians to ensure accountability, not just in this parliament, but in future parliaments. And what do I mean by accountability? I mean that all future governments are to table a plan in this House to ensure that they are going to be as prepared as possible for the next pandemic. And they're going to take efforts to reduce risks to prevent the next pandemic. And we can remember SARS. And what happened after SARS? Well, there were reports, there were studies, and there were recommendations. And some of those recommendations were even adopted, but not all. And politicians, we forgot. Politicians weren't studying those reports and calling for renewed action in the wake of that report, and it fell away. And were we as prepared as we should have been for this pandemic? Were provinces as prepared as they should have been? Was the federal government as prepared as it should have been? Absolutely not. And no one wants to relive what we lived through, but let's remember, because if we don't remember, we are destined to live through something very similar. And if we remember, we'll remember the army having to go into nursing homes. If we remember, we will remember the fear of the unknown that we all experienced, and we'll remember the great scale of loss. This required a wartime effort across levels of government and across parties to do what we needed to do to save lives. It upended so many lives, not just lives lost, but it upended employment. It upended relationships. It made it so hard for so many. What does this bill do? Because some people have said, oh, you know, we could have a plan already, and this is overreaching. This gets into provincial jurisdiction. What does this plan do? It does one thing very simply. It requires the government to table in Parliament a pandemic prevention and preparedness plan to ensure that it turns its mind to the health minister and a whole of government approach, working with ministers across government, that they turn their minds to how they can take steps to reduce pandemic risk and to prepare this government and future governments for the next pandemic. I can criticize the way the wage subsidy rolled out. I can criticize different public health measures. I was furious as the father of a now 7- and 4-year-old when Ontario closed its schools for the final time in a January. But I can tell you, we should consider the alternative. I know not everyone loves the Prime Minister today, but the Prime Minister stood outside of his home on a daily basis and acted like a Prime Minister. Delivered benefits, putting politics aside, working with opposition parties, working with other levels of government to support businesses and individuals in a time of crisis. Now let's consider the counterfactual. And if the leader of the opposition was the Prime Minister during a crisis like that, well, when faced with questions about the special budgetary measures that were being put in place, you know, everyone else was putting politics aside, not the leader of the official opposition, not the member from Carleton. He said,
when you asked the question the first time, I answered it by saying that, yes, we do believe that we need to lower taxes, eliminate regulatory red tape.
That doesn't exactly address COVID-19, though, in all fairness.
Actually, in fairness, it might not address it the way you want to address it. You might want to address it through big, fat government programs. We're conservatives, so we don't believe in that.
You almost pull the string, and the doll says the same thing again and again and again, even in a crisis. Every other party at every other level of government was willing to work across party lines to save lives and to support individuals and businesses through the crisis. And the answer from the leader of the official opposition, imagine he was the Prime Minister and he said, yes, small businesses, your lives are upended. Yes, you're losing employment because you cannot go into work because of this pandemic and this crisis. We're going to lower taxes and we're going to cut red tape. Is that a serious answer? Does anyone in this House think that's a serious answer? Absolutely not. We had a Prime Minister who was acting like a Prime Minister. Now, forget supporting the special measures. We know that the counterfactual, the Conservative Prime Minister would not have supported those special measures. But what about public health measures? Well, we had Conservatives at the time saying two things. We had them saying, well, vaccines weren't going to roll out fast enough. They did. We had Conservatives then undermining public confidence in immunization. And of course, there's a credible debate to be had about certain public health measures, and we can have that credible debate. We could have had a credible debate at the time, but we should not have had an instance where members from Sarnia-Lambton, or members from Haldimand-Norfolk, or members from Niagara West their own local health officers, whether it's the head of Norfolk EMS or the public health officer in Sarnia Lambton, they had to issue public statements correcting the record to say, no, we should defend public health efforts and you should ignore those comments from your elected officials. You should not listen to them. Yes, we can have a credible debate. What we cannot afford to undermine public confidence in immunization, because what happens then? Well, we see what is happening. We see what is happening. In Ontario, we just had the first death in years from measles. Why? Because vaccination rates have plummeted. And that is a direct consequence of the willingness to undermine public health efforts and undermine immunization. Now, again, debate is warranted and individuals can protest as they like. And I myself, as some may know in this House, I myself criticize the invocation of the Emergencies Act. What I didn't do was bring donuts and coffee and celebrate lawlessness. And again, that is not the conduct we should expect from a prime minister. That is not someone we should expect from someone who should be acting as a statesman in a crisis. It is actually the opposite of what we should expect from our leaders. And again, counterfactual, just imagine if we'd had the leader of the official opposition. And I don't say Aaron O'Toole. I think he would have managed through the crisis just fine. He's a serious person. But the individual who occupies that current chair as leader of the official opposition is unserious and would have managed us through the crisis in the most unserious way. Now, I want to close with this because I've heard some members say, well, what about agriculture? Well, you should know what's in this bill. This bill says that we've got to take efforts to address antimicrobial resistance. We should. Farmers are doing that. Agriculture is doing that. This bill says we should regulate activities to address pandemic risk. Conservatives trip over themselves to talk about biosecurity if it means ending whistleblowing on farms. But they don't want to talk about biosecurity when it means reducing pandemic risk, because that's all it is. In fact, farming operations already take pandemic risk incredibly seriously here in Canada, but not all around the world. And we see pandemics driven by spillover risks associated with animals. And what is a One Health approach? All that it is, it recognizes and addresses the fact that animal health, human health, and environmental health, they are interconnected. It does not mean, and this is, I'm going to quote the member from Renfrew. I couldn't believe it when she said it. When we're talking about promoting alternative proteins, you think we've got a huge pulse industry in Canada. It is a good thing to promote alternative proteins. Instead, the member from Renfrew says,
alternative protein is just a far left dog whistle that means crickets. What's the far left and their desire to have, what is it with the far left and their desire to have us all eat bugs?
I put that to the representative from Soy Canada. He didn't really know what to say at committee. Again, completely unserious. If we want to take efforts to prepare for the next pandemic or to reduce the risk of the next pandemic, we need this act in place, and we should also probably be very wary about electing certain conservatives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.